right, well, welcome everyone, and welcome to those of you who are attending virtually. So today we will be talking about the new lease standards. Currently, the state and local governments are working towards the implementation of the new lease standards, and they are looking to implement those for their fiscal year ends ending on June 30th and September 30th, whereas the federal agencies will be implementing with an effective date in fiscal year 2024. However, given the complexity of these standards, all federal agencies should start performing their work now. If you have not already started evaluating what your leases are and how you will account and report for them, you probably are too late. Completeness of the lease population will be a key factor that you need to dedicate a lot of time and effort to, and then the evaluation is going to be another factor that requires quite a bit of time and figuring out. The lease standards are the biggest body of change in the federal space, at least in the last 10 years. They will significantly impact federal financial statements, but not only the federal financial statements. They will change the way in which processes work. They will change the way in which the various departments communicate amongst themselves for obtaining data. They will require information systems to account and report for leases, and they will also require changes in duties and responsibilities of individuals. So quite a bit of training and rearrangement of the workforce will need to be performed. So we hope to shed light on some of these topics with our presentation today. My name is Orinda Basha. I am a director with CLA's federal practice. I have been rendering services in the federal space for the last 22 years. And today I bring a panel of participants. The first one is Anna Kichocho, who comes from the state of Washington. She is in charge of implementing GASB 87. Obviously, the state and local entities are way far ahead of the federal entity representatives in implementing the lease standards. Anna is in charge of dealing with the new lease standards. She is working on the development of policies and procedures. She's working on developing a tool for tracking the leases for all of the agencies in the Washington state. And she's also in charge of training and answering all kinds of questions related to implementation. And this is in addition to her day-to-day responsibilities, where she is involved with the preparation of the annual CAFRA for her state, and she is also involved in helping agencies with all sorts of accounting and reporting questions outside of the lease space. Anna has been working for the state of Washington in accounting and reporting functions for the last 10 years. And she holds a bachelor's degree in accounting, a master's degree in business administration, and she's also a CPA. Our second speaker is Rebecca Everts. Rebecca is a staff accountant with the Office of the Secretary of Defense at DoD. She has been critical in providing her feedback to the FASAB task force for all lease matters. She has helped with finalizing the leases standard number 54. She has also helped with the final implementation guide related to leases. Rebecca is responsible for DoD's PP&E accounting and reporting, including leases, developing policies and procedures, and overseeing the training of individuals who will be involved with implementing the new lease standards for DoD. Rebecca has worked at DoD and the Department of Transportation's in auditing, contracting, and accounting responsibilities over the last 13 years. She's a CPA, holds a bachelor's degree in accounting, and she also holds a master's degree in business administration with a concentration on information systems. So we will get started with a polling question just to get an idea on where we are with the constituents here, whether you work for a federal agency, whether you work for a state and local entity. So please do bring out your devices and please answer the polling question. And this also applies to our virtual participants, if we have any. All right. So there is quite a mix here. Probably a lot of contractors sitting in the room, and we will have to deal with auditing the results of the new lease standards, and some of us may also help federal agencies with the implementation. All right, so we will get started talking about lessons learned from the GASB 87 implementation from the state and local perspective. So Anna will start sharing some of her best practices so that you all can get some lease implementation tips and take back to your agencies or your clients, whichever is most appropriate. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, hello from the other Washington, on the other side of the country. So we're implementing GASB Statement 87 for fiscal year ending June 30, 2022, so we're not quite done yet. But I want to start with a little context about our state and our lease portfolio. So the state of Washington has a $60 to $70 billion annual budget. Of course, that's fluctuated in recent years with the federal funding. Our lease portfolio includes primarily buildings, but also a lot of land and equipment leases, as well as receivable lease contracts, and that is mostly for land. During our implementation, we analyzed over 1,000 contracts, of which approximately 500 are within scope and meet our capitalization threshold. So we expect to add over $1 billion in assets and liabilities to our statement of net position this fiscal year end. So although we're not done yet, today I'm here to share with you the three key things that I would focus on or do differently if I could have a do-over, right, on this implementation. The first is I would start creating the lease contract inventory early and make it as comprehensive as possible. I would bring the different departments together from the start, and I would not underestimate our resource needs and ask for what we truly need. Okay, so let's get into each of these a little bit deeper. So one of the very first steps you will take in the implementation will be to create the comprehensive list of your lease contracts and their key data elements. This lease inventory is the foundation for the rest of the project, as it will drive so many other decisions, including what components of the statement apply to your organization, what policies you need to establish. One of the primary policies we use ours for is for setting our capitalization threshold. But you will also use this inventory to help you determine whether you need a lease accounting system, and it will start your requirements. It will be the start of the list of requirements, I guess, that you need for that system. So I recommend you start compiling the inventory early, because this first step may take longer than you think it will. At least it did for us. So it took a while for us to even get the lease contracts to the right people to begin analyzing them, because the lease management is really decentralized here. Each state agency is responsible for managing their own lease contracts, and each agency manages them a little bit differently. So one agency, there may be one department that is responsible for equipment leases and a different responsible for building leases. And of course, those two departments are separate from the accounting function, right? And at other agencies, each regional office may be responsible for their own lease contracts. And so the devil is in the details when it comes to this accounting standard. And not just the standard, but lease contracts themselves. It's a complicated standard with a lot of new terms and a lot of components to consider. And many lease contracts may be simple, but we found that it took us a while to work through the more complicated topics and contracts, such as whether the lease is actually within scope, especially whether it conveys control of the right to use the asset. We found that to be especially true on our receivable leases for land. We have a lot of those. I didn't include that in my number at the beginning because we have a lot of contracts that just don't meet the definition of a lease because of it doesn't convey the control of the right to use the asset. So it's really important to have a good grasp on what that means. But we also spent a lot of time helping agency tease out what the true lease term is, right? Including those renewal options. And when a contract combination should occur when you have multiple leases that are entered into around the same time. It sounds simple when you read it, but it's not as simple when you're actually applying a lot of these, a lot of the components of the standard. So in addition, there's a lot of variety in how lease contracts are structured, right? You may have different types of assets. The start dates could vary. They may start at a lot of them will start probably on the 1st, but how do you handle those lease contracts when they start mid-month? The payment frequency could vary. The types of payments could vary. You may have variable payments and you may have non-lease components, right? I mean, the list goes on and on. I think the point here is that the sooner you start learning what scenarios your organization has, the sooner you'll be able to set a plan and potentially find a system to handle each of those different scenarios. And this leads into my last point on why you should start early. As you go through the details of the contracts, expect there to be some surprises. Be on the lookout for those embedded leases. As you prepare the inventory, remember to start with the list as comprehensive as possible because you can always whittle it down later as you get into the details. But you don't want to miss anything, right? So you should evaluate any contract that includes the right to use an asset, not just leases, right? One example that surprised me was a waste management contract that at face value seemed like a utility or a service contract. But when we got into the details more, the contract includes the rental or the control of that dumpster, as well as the waste management company coming to empty it every 2 weeks. So as I said, this lease inventory is your foundation for the other decisions. So the more comprehensive it is, and the sooner you're able to get it done, hopefully the more successful the rest of the implementation will be. So next, early on, determine which departments may be involved with the lease contracts and get the team together early. This standard is not just an accounting change. I think Arinda covered this very well in the intro. This truly is a cross-functional change, and it really is unlike, even for us as well, it's unlike any of the standards we've implemented in any recent years. It requires coordination and business process changes in many departments. So be sure to include everyone that even touches those lease contracts. Along with finance, of course, you may need to involve procurement, facilities management, or your real estate offices, your legal, information technology teams. And if you're a lessor, you may also need to include additional departments, such as each of the programs that manage those lease receivable contracts. We found that these different departments were often siloed within their agencies. So it was common that the finance staff weren't even sure who to contact within their agency to get a copy of the lease contract. So another reason why it's important for you to gather the team and get them together. We actually gathered a facilities contact and an accounting contact for each agency and then shared that with everybody. And once you know who to include, like I said, get this team together early, but also educate them on the new standard and help them understand what it means for them. Because this team is going to help you with a lot, right? They will help create the lease contract inventory. They're also, one of their more important functions is going to be to determine what the new business processes will be. So for example, when a new lease contract is signed, who should be notified so that it can be evaluated? What information do they need to do this analysis? How will they get it? What will be the process if there's a lease amendment? And how will the variable and non-lease components get paid? They have to follow a slightly different path, right? So there's lots of questions for the team to answer. And this team will also be really important in estimating your resource needs. And so this is I saved my biggest regret, I guess, for last, right? So as you get ready to submit your budget request, or maybe as you're considering a second one, make sure that you do not underestimate your resource needs. I think this is especially important now when most of us are already understaffed and under-resourced. And the people who are working on this implementation are probably doing it in addition to their regular job duties. So my regret is that we asked for what we thought we could get rather than what we really needed, because I don't think we fully grasped the scale and complexity of this standard at the time. We definitely underestimated the change management involved. This standard is truly a paradigm shift, I think, in how We all think about and account for the operating leases. It took a lot longer than we expected for people to really grasp what the entries would look like and why we have to record principal and interest now, right, on these leases. Also, there's a lot of new terms and policies, and so it's, I think, necessary to build in plenty of time for education and creating resources and tools to help staff with things like determining what is actually in scope, what the lease term is, and how to categorize the different types of payments. And as you are putting together your resource needs, keep in mind that other departments or divisions across the organization may also need resources. It's not just the financial reporting team. Some of our larger agencies have formed new lease management teams to centralize the contract management and accounting function related to these leases. But this standard is also changing who is responsible for lease accounting. In the past, it was pretty simple. An accounts payable clerk could make the lease payments along with the other monthly bills. But now there's a more experienced accountant that is responsible for analyzing the lease contracts, recording data in the system, preparing journal entries, and reconciling. I mean, there's just a lot more to it now. And one of the biggest resource decisions, of course, that you're going to be making is investing in the right software. And every organization's lease portfolio looks different. But you should really consider purchasing software, even if you only have a handful of leases. When we first submitted our budget request, there were funding constraints, and at the time, there weren't as many software options as there are now. So we asked for funding for the system that we knew we could get approved for, rather than, again, what I think we really needed. So we decided to add on to a facilities management tool that was already used to statewide to track our state's leased and owned facilities, and it is working, right? But the primary issue we face is that the system really was designed to manage facilities. It is not a lease tracking and accounting software. So that is definitely presenting challenges for us now. And if I could go back, we would have spent a lot more time gathering a more complete lease inventory and really building up our business case so that we could request funding for a more robust leasing software. And of course, don't forget to include resources for maintenance and the ongoing data capture for the new leases, as well as any changes to your existing. This standard is permanently changing those business processes. So this concludes my lessons learned from our implementation of GASB Statement number 87, and I hope that you can learn something from my regrets, and I wish you all the best of luck in your implementations. So we'll take questions at the end of the presentation, and now I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca to discuss Leases implementation by the Department of Defense. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today. And thanks to technology, we can be together in a virtual setting to discuss how the Department of Defense started its implementation journey of SFAS 54 and what DoD is considering as top priorities in regards to leases. So DoD has started SFAS 54 implementation efforts at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, OSD, or headquarters level, and the component level. We strongly believe that SFAS 54 is one of the largest changes to leases in federal accounting in the last decade. Therefore, prior to start on the implementation journey, my office has done a total review of SFAS 54 in order to get a good understanding of the new framework for lease accounting. Then based on our comprehensive review of the standard, my office has issued a policy memorandum back in September of 2020, which establishes a financial reporting policy for all DoD components regarding implementation of SFAS 54. As we all know, the standard is not effective until October 1st of 2023, and early implementation is not permitted. We are fully aware that implementation efforts will likely take well over a year. Therefore, we directed the DoD components to begin preparatory SFAS 54 implementation efforts immediately. We did this to ensure two things. First, that corrective actions currently underway are leveraged to support SFAS 54 implementation. And secondly, so that DoD components are fully prepared to comply by the effective date of SFAS 54. Some of the preparatory implementation efforts include activities such as planning, training, developing internal control processes, establishing business processes and standard operating procedures, identifying a complete universe of leases, and collecting required data to enable implementation at the start of the fiscal year of which SFAS 54 becomes effective. Next slide, please. Now we're going to discuss the different tools and coordination that my office has used to this point. We understand that the implementation of the new lease standards will require significant efforts, resources, and poses some unique challenges to DoD. Despite the challenges, we are still striving to obtain the most current, accurate, and complete population for audit purposes. For this reason, we have provided the DoD component with some helpful information for implementation. We have created a tool which consists of initial lease assessment surveys to assist DoD components in identifying their existing leases population. We highly encourage DoD components to use this tool as a starting point, especially for those that didn't even know where to start looking for their existing leases. So this tool was designed to ensure DoD components are actively thinking through all the different asset types that they usually use in their operation and to trace these back to any existing leases. It also considers all significant lines of services received from and those provided to federal and non-federal entities for the identification of right-to-use physical assets dedicated to such services through the use of trial balance accounts. There is also a questionnaire to assist with the identification of those more complex contracts and agreements that may contain like both a lease component, for example, right to use of a building, and non-lease components, for example, maintenance service of the building, and also leases of multiple underlying assets. We often refer to such lease components as embedded leases. Furthermore, SFAS 54 will require additional and more extensive disclosures for lessees and lessors, for regular leases, intergovernmental leases, and also in the financial report of the U.S. government. Therefore, my office has identified the major new disclosure requirements, so DoD components are fully aware of these and can start gathering detailed data points on existing leases in order to comply with SFAS 54 accounting and disclosure requirements. Due to changes in the leases criteria and classifications, custom configurations of systems for financial reporting and for capturing and classifying data will be required. In order to support the DoD components in this process as well, we also prepared a list of DoD recommended data elements. My office came up with a total of 82 data elements, of which we are recommending the DoD components to capture in their respective financial systems in order to facilitate the lease accounting and disclosure requirements. You know that this new lease standard leaves DoD with a major completeness challenge ahead of it in identifying agreements that were not originally identified or accounted for as leases, but will need to be as the new standards implementation date. So to help the DoD components in establishing completeness of their leases populations, our fire directorate developed and conducted a lease survey to determine the landscape of potential lease agreements across the department. Through this survey and interviewing lease point of contacts across the military departments, we hope to assess the DoD environment to determine where the contracts or agreements that may potentially be leases are stored. Furthermore, based on the results of the completed survey, we hope to develop an automated process using tools within Advana to read agreements through the use of optical character recognition, also known as OCR, to determine if these agreements, contracts are leases, potential leases requiring additional evaluation, or non-leases based on SFAS 54 criteria. Another major effort as part of our implementation journey was that DoD actively participated in the FASAP Leases Task Force and assisted with the formulation of FASAP's implementation guidance for leases and omnibus amendments to SFAS 54. Our participation was key as we obtained a much better understanding of the standard itself, and we have identified areas that needed clarification, which have been addressed by FASAP. In order to prepare for the implementation of the new leases standards, we believe it's important setting an environment that is inclusive of all key stakeholders within DoD, including policy and operations. Anna made this point clear in her presentation as well. We addressed this new lease standard in the various already existing asset working groups that we currently have, for example, the general equipment and real property. We found this beneficial as these working groups allow us to have open conversations with different stakeholders, and we were able to address asset category specific barriers that might impede the implementation of the new leases standards. Next slide, please. Up to this point, I have discussed what has been done at the OSD headquarters level. However, DoD components have also started some preparatory implementation efforts. Even though we have issued lease policy and guidance at the OSD level, each DoD component will be responsible for issuing more detailed policy and implementation guidance for their respective field offices, and will also be responsible for a timely implementation. So several DoD components are currently in a discovery stage by gathering data, specifically supporting documentation such as lease contracts and agreements on their existing leases to determine appropriate policy, processes, and systems required for implementation. Additionally, they are reviewing available data and known populations to determine how this data can best be leveraged and expanded upon to support implementation and sustainment of SFAS 54. DoD components are also doing data calls in order to obtain essential lease information from their respective subcomponents. Undoubtedly, one of the major efforts is to identify and review the current existing leases population. Components are reviewing terms and conditions of unexpired leases as of October 1st of 2023, in order to determine the remaining lease term, the parties involved, and whether it transfers ownership to the lessee. This thorough review will allow the DoD components to determine the new lease category and its respective accounting treatment, basically whether to expense or to capitalize the lease. Setting milestone is also very important in the implementation process. Milestones, phases, and respective deadlines can be established for first, analyzing and determining the leases population. Secondly, for the compilation of existing lease supporting documentation, and also for the reassessment of internal controls. Some components have developed a plan of action and a milestone in order to implement SS54. This plan includes, for example, data call to establish the current lease and lease-like population, work with the system developers to create a method of identifying various types of leases, possibly through the use of specific asset classes. And also they develop business processes and key internal controls to ensure effective implementation and sustainment, and also to train property, plant, and equipment personnel on the new lease processes and controls. Some components are in the early phase of evaluating whether their financial system providers have sufficient capabilities to support SS54. They're validating whether their system have the correct posting logic for leases and assessing the changes needed to comply with the standard. Here, software parameters are being discussed, mapped, and documented. So lease repository and accounting IT solutions are being evaluated and scoped based on these software parameters. As you all know, these changes go beyond accounting policy, which significantly affect lease strategies, controls, audit readiness, and operations of many departments, including like the CFO, Controller Office, property management, procurement, legal, and IT. Therefore, components have formed internal cross-functional teams inclusive of all these different departments for the coordination, collaboration, engagement, and training of applicable personnel. Next slide, please. Now I would like to discuss what are DoD priorities regarding leases. DoD main priority will be to identify, review, recategorize, and account for the leases and be fully prepared to comply by the effective date of SS54. Given the implementation of the new framework for lease accounting will require substantial effort, one of the major efforts will be to identify the current existing leases population. Our main goal is to identify and verify existing leases across all military departments, military bases, and other DoD components for materiality, accuracy, and completeness. We are aiming to identify our leases population by reviewing existing financial reporting processes. DoD components can produce universe of transactions from their financial system of record in order to identify existing leases transactions. Also, the current accounts of which leases are booked against in the general ledgers and on the financial statement will be assessed in order to obtain the existing leases population. Additionally, reviewing the terms and conditions of existing supporting documentations, such as lease contracts and agreements, will also be used during the evaluation of the lease population. DoD components are also conducting several lease assessment data calls for all of their respective subcomponents. And we hope through the use of technology enable solutions such as the OCR, as I mentioned earlier, to assist us with the abstraction of necessary data from lease contracts and agreements. Having adequate internal controls in place is another priority, as it plays a major role in obtaining an unmodified audit opinion. Therefore, it will be important to first assess our current internal controls and then identify and define new internal controls during the lease reassessment phase or process. Accordingly, we need to reassess our current internal controls related to leases and modify these as needed to ensure compliance with the accounting requirements of SFAS 54. DoD as a whole has been undergoing financial audits of its annual financial report since fiscal year 2018. And we are aware that DoD has received numerous notice of findings and recommendations related to internal controls. Therefore, the reassessment and modifications of internal controls are critical steps in this process. Since updates of internal controls we know that it can be substantial and also a challenge, these should not be left for last minute action. Another DoD priority will be to reassess and rescore the existing leases and categorize these in the new leases categories. Since each DoD component will be responsible for a timely implementation of the new lease standard, DoD components will have to develop like an end-to-end leasing process that will include policies and procedure to identify, account, and track leasing arrangements. The end-to-end leasing process will allow for disclosure of leases, including any future obligations, and accurate representation on the DoD financial statements. Finally, the last but not least priority is for DoD components to continue to evaluate whether their respective financial systems have sufficient capabilities to identify the leases, financially report them, and also to account for the leases. We are aiming to employ technology solution designed to address the accountability and accounting aspects of the new lease standards. It's important for the accounting, for the accountability to meet accounting. So this concludes my presentation, and I hope I provided some helpful information of where DoD is and what our priorities are. My closing remark would be, if your agency has not yet started any preparatory implementation efforts, I highly recommend you to get started immediately, just as Orinda and Anna also highlighted this in her presentation. So the clock is ticking, and October 1st, 2023 will be here sooner than you think. Thank you.
Great. So we will do a polling question to see where the agencies that you all work at or work with stand. So if you could please answer just so that we can get an idea. Measure the pulse here. Okay, well, it looks like there is quite a bit of work that remains to be accomplished in the federal space here. If the agencies have not done much in terms of implementation, probably they are way too late to start now. So please go back to your agencies and take back the message to get started as soon as possible. And from our presenters, you all heard that one of the very first decisions that needs to be made is to make sure that you have the appropriate budget to bring in the appropriate resources, whether it is system resources or people who will be helping you with the implementation of the standard. Otherwise, that clean opinion on the financial statements that federal agencies have fought so hard to achieve for so many years may be in jeopardy in 2024 and going forward. So we do have some questions, and I will get started with Rebecca. So Rebecca, well, I believe that both speakers already answered the question that they will be using software to assist with the implementation of the standard. But my question for Rebecca is specific to DoD on whether DoD plans to enhance existing systems or acquire new systems that will help you all account for leases under the new standard using a clean state.
Okay. Well, we tried to do that at the beginning a couple of years ago to come with one software for the whole DoD, but it seems like some of the military department didn't really agree with that. So, and since they have different financial system, so we made a decision, leadership made the decision back then to leave it up to each military, in each DoD component to determine what software they would like to use, whatever best fit their existing financial system. Some of them decide to modify their existing system. Some of others decide to maybe use a new software.
All right, great. This second question has to do whether you have heard from your auditors about whether and how they will test for the lease accounting standard implementation. And Anna, this will apply to you more because the effective implementation date for your agency will be June 30th, 2022. But has your state of Washington already had any discussions or any work with the auditors regarding the implementation of the lease standard?
So we set our capitalization threshold. So I don't know if people know, but there was a delay in the effective date of GASB Statement 87 when the pandemic hit. So this has been ongoing for quite a while for us, but obviously we had some other priorities in the meantime that we had to address. But what I'm trying to say is it was a while ago that the auditors reviewed our capitalization threshold. But since then, we haven't really had many discussions. They've started their planning for this fiscal year end. And so we've had some discussions. They're trying to get, I think, a grasp more than anything on, what that lease population looks like and how they're going to test it. So we don't have a lot of details yet.
I see. And Rebecca, has DoD started any conversations with any of the audit firms regarding the new lease standard, or is that too far out in the future to start engaging in those conversations now?
That I'm aware, so far, we haven't started any conversation with any of the audit firms yet. I think since we're still in the discovery early stage of implementation, and early implementation is not permitted, so we haven't had any of those conversations yet that I'm aware of.
All right, well, that probably is the best practice to get started communicating with your auditors soon, because one key audit objective is going to be the completeness of the lease population, and perhaps the auditors can test that alongside with the agencies as they are going through the implementation process. That is very important, because if the auditors find out a few days before they are about to issue the opinion that you do not have a complete population, then basically you have blown the opinion for that fiscal year. So coordination with the audit firms is critical, even if you are early on in the planning stages, to make sure that everybody is well informed and there is a game plan on how these new leases will be audited going forward.
Rena, let me clarify, maybe I wasn't clear. At the OSD level, let me clarify, at the OSD level, we didn't have any conversation with the IPA specifically, but however, the DoD components could have, with their individual IPAs, they could have had these conversations.
Great.
And which we encourage that.
Great. The next question is addressed to Anna. What are some of the challenges that you face by using a facility management software module rather than a lease accounting software?
So, the software already contained basically all the key data points for the facilities lease contracts, which, as I mentioned, is the primary thing that we lease here. And so that was why we used it. But we had to build in all of the calculations to calculate the amortization schedule for the lease liability, for the lease asset, for the amortization on the lease asset. So all of this had to be developed and designed, and we added this onto a system, it's the company that does the software, right? They don't have that accounting background. They don't have that knowledge. So, I guess the challenge is that we designed it all by ourselves. And it's a very complex standard. There's a lot to these calculations. And so I think that's the primary thing, is just making sure that we are calculating everything properly, that we have good audit records, right? That we have good internal controls around the system, because all of this stuff had to be added by us. It wasn't just already designed into the system. Whereas I think if you get some of the universities are also part of the state of Washington. And so one of the largest university here, University of Washington, got their own system. And, all of these internal controls, the calculation of the amortization schedule, all of that is already built into the system. They didn't really have to worry about all of that. So I think that's the biggest difference from what we did.
All right, Anna, since I have you on, another question for you. When you say start early, can you give us an example of a specific timeline? So start early 2 years ago, start early 3 years ago, start early 1 year?
Yeah, great question. It's hard because, like I said, there was the delay in our implementation. So we started our implementation back in 2018, I want to say, started discussions because of our budget. We have a biennial budget cycle as well. And so in order to hit that, and you got to prepare a year ahead of time to get your requests in. So I think So your budget cycle is what I'm trying to say is going to make a big difference. But I think that the main thing is it could take you at least a year or at least 6 months just to get your inventory really solid and thorough. And like I said, that inventory is really the foundation for the rest of your implementation. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Anna. The other two questions are addressed to Rebecca. What OCR software are you using to assist with the review of leases?
Well, we're still in the process. Based on the survey that our fire directorate has done, we're still evaluating depending on the input we have received. But then we hope to use using some tools within Advana. This is like a platform, a database that we have financial and non-financial information that was developed by OSD. We hope to use that, and I'm not sure about which specific OCR software, if we decide to go this route, will be used. We don't know yet at this point in time.
Great. And then the second one for Rebecca is a request more than a question. So some participants are asking whether you could share the DoD implementation memo and tools for the session attendees here so that they can use as best practice materials.
Okay, so sure. That's on our public website, FMR website, webpage. All our, the FMR chapters, there is a section for policy memorandum. You will see that it was issued back in September of 2020. And I highly recommend you to download the policy memo on your computer, and that way you can access the tools are embedded in the memo. I'm specifying this because if you look at on the web page itself, you won't see the tools and you won't see the other attachments. So in order for you to see all the tools and the attachments, you will have to save these on your computer. Great. And if you can't, you can always reach out to me, and I can provide you the specific link. But it's on our FMR webpage. It's publicly available. You don't even need a CAC.
Great, that's very helpful. And with that, we are on time. So thank you so much to our presenters, and thank you for our audience for being here.